Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the online Hot Politics Lab. Today we have, I'm very happy to introduce to you Professor Jennifer Jerit, who just moved throughout a pandemic to Dartmouth College. I'm really excited to have Jen here with us today. She is on our radar for a long period of time because of all the excellent work she's been doing, which range on a very broad range of topics, from how do we measure political knowledge, what's going on with media effects, stuff on morality, and how people respond to moral rhetoric. So a plethora of methods, a plethora of questions that she answers. And today her talk will be on misinformation. We did not plan it to be this topical as it turns out to be in terms of the what's happening in the United States. I'm not sure if we're going to talk about that in particular. Maybe Jen has to check some election results throughout the talk. But without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Jen, who is here today, by the way, with her co-author, who is also joining us, Robert Vidigal.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. All right, can everybody see everything fine? Okay, great, thank you so much. It has been a crazy past few months, so it's really excited to give this presentation because it makes me feel like a real scholar again after doing a lot of moving and unpacking and getting settled. And so this is a great opportunity. And this really comes at a fantastic time in this project for me and Rob, because we could really benefit from some feedback. And so the title of our presentation is When Do People Correct Misinformation? And the motivation for this talk really has to do with what we see as a patchwork of findings in the literature on corrections. And so if you spend any amount of time looking at this literature, you'll see that corrections sometimes work and sometimes do not. There also are many single issue studies, so studies where scholars look at a single topic or maybe just a handful of topics. And so this really makes the accumulation of findings difficult. When we look at studies where we see these different patterns and the topic or the issue is changing across studies, it's hard to know what's contributing to the pattern. Is it the particular topic? Is it the design? It's just hard to really draw a thread through these different kinds of findings and make sense of them. And we even see instances of contrary patterns on the same, even highly partisan issues. So I found this to be very confusing literature in a lot of ways. And other people have as well. And so just not too long ago, Brian Weeks, a communications scholar, came to basically the same conclusion, saying it's clear that corrections sometimes work, but what's not apparent is how or why they succeed or fail when one's attempting to challenge partisan-based claims. So I was talking about this piece by Ecker and Eng. They came to a very similar conclusion, and in the process of trying to make sense of this literature, they speculate that the key to understanding this pattern might be this idea of centrality, that people are more likely to cling to false beliefs when those beliefs are central to their political identity. And so this is a pretty intuitive idea, but it really represents their attempt to identify a more general pattern across the literature. And in their piece, they try to manipulate centrality. They do it in the context of a hypothetical experiment. And so Rob and I thought this was a pretty provocative idea. And so we try to theorize about two factors specific to issues that we think bear upon this idea of centrality. And so the first one is very intuitive, and it's whether an issue or topic is polarized along partisan or ideological lines. The studies we look at in this paper are in the US context, so I'm talking about the traditional differences between Democrats and Republicans. And so this is intuitive. I don't think it needs a lot of motivation because it's a very strong prediction from the literature that people often have a strong motive to be consistent with their partisan identity, even if that means endorsing false beliefs. And so that might motivate somebody to believe something that's inaccurate. Another less common factor or something that has not received as much attention has to do with issue importance. And so this refers to the subjective sense of concern or significance that a person might attach to an issue. John Krosnick has talked a lot about issue importance. It has a number of different labels. Psychologists often refer to this as personal relevance or issue involvement, but the basic idea is the same in that it's a topic or issue that a person has this subjective sense of concern with. And there's a wide range of evidence that when people find an issue or topic personally important, they engage in much more elaborative information processing on that topic. They seek out more information. They see bigger differences between politicians on those issues. And they think about it a lot more. So they cognitively elaborate about these issues a lot more. That said, this is not synonymous with having an accuracy motive. And so there's also a parallel set of results showing that on important issues, people often engaged in biased information processing because their main motive is to protect those important attitudes. And so we thought this might help shed some light on the wide array of empirical patterns in this literature. Now, it's often the case that personal issue importance has a high degree of overlap with partisan identity. So somebody might, there might be a partisan issue that a person finds personally important, but it doesn't always have to be that way. And Kevin Mullenix made this point in a recent political behavior article, that the two often pull in opposite directions. And so we want to try to parse these effects both conceptually and empirically in this study. And so our hypotheses are that a corrective message will be less effective in changing false beliefs when misinformation is politicized than when it's not. And by politicized, we simply mean that the topic is aligned with a person's partisan or ideological identity in sort of a conventional sense. We also hypothesize that a corrective message will be less effective in changing false beliefs among people who view the issue as personally important relative to those who do not view the issue as relatively important. Okay, so we're going to test these hypotheses across 3 studies. I'm going to attempt to talk about the first 2 today, so that will entail going sort of quickly. They were both national survey experiments administered by DINATA last spring at separate times. The third study is a pre-registered study, and it's in the field. It's finishing up probably sometime today. So we did different things across these studies. We were trying to leverage different design features. In the first study, we tried to manipulate the degree to which a single issue is politicized as a way of testing the first hypothesis. We measure issue importance as a way of testing the second hypothesis. We measure it pre-treatment, of course. In the second study, we're going to take advantage of natural variation across issues. So issues will have varying levels of politicization, and we also measure importance. And then in the third study, we have manipulated issue importance. And so we do a combination of manipulating our key variables and also measuring them. All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time showing you the stimuli, but I have them all in the appendix if people have questions about them. So in the first study, we are looking at the topic of GM foods. It's an analytically very useful topic because it's not presently aligned along partisan lines in the US, but there also is a pretty high level of misinformation about this topic in the sense that mass public opinion tends to be pretty misinformed about the nutritional content of GM foods and also their safety, especially relative to the expert community. So we're looking at a single topic, and we have a between subjects design where we will attempt to make GM foods more or less politicized. And so that's the main way we're going to test our first hypothesis. This is a conventional misinformation study in the sense that participants read a fake but realistically inspired news story about GM foods. There was a bit of background information about the topic. The story primed existing misperceptions about GM foods, and so it made mention to the fact that some people think that nutritional content in GM foods is lower, and it raised questions about safety. And so we primed these common misperceptions. And then the key part of the story was a third paragraph that contained an additional critique against GM foods. And so that critique was either very general and having to do with the ethics of GM foods, or it could have been more politicized. And in the liberal version, critiques were raised that aligned with democratic or liberal concerns about the effect on the environment. And in the conservative version, critiques were raised about the effect on the business community, agricultural regulations, and so on. We pre-tested all elements of the stimuli so that we knew they were having the effect that we intended them to. I can talk about that later as well. And so participants read the initial story where misinformation was primed, and then they subsequently read a correction. So everybody ultimately was corrected. The key way we will estimate the treatment effect is that people in the no correction group answered the outcome questions before receiving that subsequent correction. So I'm going to refer to no correction and correction groups, even though everybody was ultimately corrected. And so we will be looking at level of misinformation, and our expectation, of course, is that the level of misinformation measured by people's responses to factual belief questions should be lower in the treatment conditions, and that would correspond with cells 4, 5, and 6 in the figure I'm showing you. All right, so that's the design. All right, I think those are the key design elements for now. I'm just going to briefly show you what one of the stimuli looked like. This was the story in the politicized liberal condition. You can see it looked pretty realistic. We also have images that help bolster our attempt to politicize these issues. Okay, so you're looking at the politicized liberal stimulus. All right, so the key, just to remind you, let me just go back one second. The key, well, actually, I'll just keep going. So what I'm showing you here, I'll remind you of the hypotheses and what you should be looking for in a moment. But right now, I'm showing you a table that's going to look, you're going to see several of these. And so I just want to talk through the structure of this table. Our outcome measures were factual belief questions about the nutrition and safety of GM foods. We measured the dependent variables on 0 to 100 scale, so people were answering a sliding question about the truth or falsity of nutrition and safety of GM foods. And higher values indicate a more misinformed response. And so right here, we are showing you the level of misinformation about nutrition and safety for the entire sample. So we're not testing our hypotheses yet, but you can easily see the expected pattern that levels of misinformation go down in the correction groups. And I'm showing the difference in that grayed box. And we're seeing about a 10 or 11 point difference across the no correction and the correction groups. All of these differences are significant. And so that's the basic structure of the table, and you can see the same pattern across all conditions. Now, when we want to test our first hypothesis, we're going to be looking at a very targeted set of comparisons. So again, you'll remember that we have a politicized liberal and a politicized conservative condition. And so we will look for evidence for our first hypothesis by seeing if partisans were less likely to correct misinformation about GM foods when that issue had become aligned with their partisanship. And so in the case of Democrats, for example, we're going to see if they are more resistant to correction in that politicized liberal group compared to the corresponding partisans in the non-politicized condition. And so this is where we're essentially doing a difference in difference here. So we're looking at the treatment effect and seeing if it's smaller in these politicized conditions. And that would be I view as sort of the standard. Now the same table, but we're just looking at Democrats and Republicans. And so if you look at the first part of the table, we're just looking at self-identified Democrats in our sample. And I've identified the key comparisons with these red boxes. And so you can see that Democrats in the politicized liberal condition readily took up corrective information. So they evinced a 11 point correction. So their misinformation went down even when GM foods had been aligned with their partisanship. And as you can just tell sort of by visually looking at these two values, there's no significant difference in difference. And so the change, the reduction in misinformation for Democrats in the politicized liberal group was not significantly smaller than that corresponding change for Democrats in the non-politicized group. We get the same pattern for Democrats on the safety outcome as well. And then you also see, if you move down to the part of the table that's showing the pattern for Republicans, we see the same pattern in which we are observing significant correction effects even in these politicized conditions. And in fact, if you look at the pattern for nutrition, it almost looks like Republicans are more willing to correct misinformation in the politicized conservative group relative to the non-politicized group. This isn't a significant different in difference, but it is a difference in an unexpected direction. And so this was quite surprising to us. It's a pattern that goes against, I think, what we were both expecting in terms of the existing literature, especially if you think about the large literature on backfire effects and how partisans aren't willing to accept information that challenges their existing views. All right, so definitely some results that seem to counter the first hypothesis in terms of factual beliefs. We also included attitude items in our first study. So there's a new set of research, sort of more recent research on misinformation, showing that people often correct beliefs, but their attitudes remain intact. So we include attitude items. And we found the same pattern here, which is to say partisans were changing their opinions in the direction of the corrective information. And so with both beliefs and attitudes, we are not finding a lot of support for our first hypothesis. All right, so let's move on to the second hypothesis. Here we're going to have a pretty similar strategy in the sense that we're looking to see if corrective effects vary according to personal importance. And so we measured importance pre-treatment in a very standard way, a la John Krosnick. And so we are grouping respondents into important and not important groups. And so again, this is a measured characteristic. If respondents were in the important group, if they said GM foods was either very or extremely important to them personally. And our expectation is that people in the important group would be less likely to correct misinformation than people who thought GM foods was not all that important. This expectation is based upon existing data that shows that people tend to be pretty misinformed about GM foods in terms of nutrition and safety. All right. And so here I'm showing the results a little bit differently in terms of graphs. The height of the column refers to the level of misinformation. The light gray bars correspond. Both groups of respondents correct misinformation, so misinformation goes down in the correction group, but there is a significant difference in the size of that correction effect across the groups. So you can see it visually here when you do an actual DID model. This is the difference between, for example, 7 and 14 percentage points is significant. And so this is consistent with the second hypothesis that importance, the subjective sense of importance is acting as a barrier to correction. All right, so I want to move on to study 2. We have a similar design in a lot of ways, but instead of looking at a single issue, now we wanted to look at issues that naturally varied in their degree of being politicized. There was some real benefits to looking at a single issue and having a very tight, clean design and trying to make that issue more or less partisan, but it also has some limitations. So in this study, we have the same basic design. It's a between subjects study, but now we look at 3 different issues. We again look at GM foods as our non-partisan or non-politicized issue, but then we selected abortion and nuclear power for 2 issues that more directly implicate partisan identity. So what we did here was we tried to have a parallel set of stimuli where we were trying to prime and then correct misperceptions about trends and facts related to all of these issues. And so abortion and nuclear power are very useful because they each feature trends, over time trends that implicate partisan identity. So abortion has some trends that we think Republicans would find it uncomfortable to accept regarding the decline in abortion rates in the United States. And then there's an analogous trend regarding nuclear power that we think Democrats would be motivated to, on which Democrats would be motivated to have false beliefs. And I could talk more about our issue selection a little bit later. So you can see same basic structure. So just to orient you, we think, for example, that Republicans will have much smaller corrective effects on abortion, so that 2 versus 5 comparison relative to those same Republicans on GM foods. Okay, so the issue is changing. But what's valuable about this design is that Democrats and Republicans, the partisan motives are inherent to these issues. These are highly salient partisan issues. So we think this should be a stronger test of our first hypothesis. The other different thing about study 2 is that instead of having 2 factual belief outcomes, we have 3 factual belief outcomes for each issue. This should increase the reliability of our dependent variable. And then one other design feature that I want to show you right here is that each respondent, irrespective of treatment assignment, was asked factual belief questions about all topics. And so looking at the GM foods condition, for example, in the top left, GM facts, that's underlined. That's the target fact. People read about GM foods and then they were asked about GM foods. They were also asked about abortion facts and nuclear power facts. We're thinking of those as placebo observations. They give us valuable information about people's baseline level of information about these other topics that we haven't treated them on. All right. So we didn't have that in our first study. It's going to be very useful to us in this study. And of course, there was random presentation in terms of the order of the GM foods, abortion, and nuclear power facts. All right, so just some preliminaries before getting into the study 2 results. What these placebo observations allow us to do is to discern whether there are issue main effects in our data, and there are. So baseline misinformation about nuclear power is higher than the other 2 issues, and correction effects were correspondingly smaller on that issue relative to the other 2. That's not necessarily good or bad, it's just a feature of these data, and we need to interpret our results through that lens. More intriguing, I think, is this pattern regarding issue importance, which is respondents who reported that an issue was important to them were significantly more misinformed than other respondents. And so we have pretty good data on that in this study using these placebo observations. And we didn't have that information in our first study. So I think this is intriguing. Let me just move on and show you, again, the familiar presentation of these difference and differences. Here, the cell entries look a little bit different because we have, the dependent variable is not on a 0 to 100 scale. We have 3 item scales for each of our issues, so that's why the values look a little bit different. You see this pretty similar pattern though. So across conditions, we see significant correction effects. Partisans taking up corrective information. In the case of nuclear power, where we might expect Democrats to be motivated to cling to those false beliefs, we see a significant correction effect. It is smaller, though, than the corresponding correction effect for Democrats on GM foods. So here I'm looking at that 0.379 versus 0.723. This is a significant difference. We know, though, from the previous slide that there's this issue main effect for nuclear power. Everybody found it more difficult to correct on nuclear power. So we still read this as being pretty ambiguous evidence regarding hypothesis 1. And in fact, if you look at Republicans, you'll see the more familiar pattern where Republicans are correcting on a politicized issue. And in fact, their level of correction is higher than the correction that we see for the non-politicized issues. So this pattern for Republicans is definitely not in support of hypothesis 1. So on balance, the evidence regarding hypothesis 1 is pretty, I would say it's not supportive, with the exception of this one ambiguous pattern for Democrats. Now turning to importance, and this will be the last set of results I show you. Here, the same strategy where we're comparing the degree of correction, so are we reducing false beliefs according to this measured importance variable. And so a pretty similar pattern, although not identical to study 1. So we see that all respondents, irrespective of their the importance with which they rate GM foods lower their level of misinformation. But it's not a significant difference as it was with study 1. Owing to the fact that high importance people were more misinformed going into this, though, they remain more misinformed even after being corrected. And so you can see that by comparing the height of the gray bars. And so this pattern here in GM foods, and then also on the other two issues, is signaling that there's something about importance that is making it difficult for people to correct false beliefs. So we don't have the significant DID, but we do get a pretty similar pattern in the sense that issue importance is playing some sort of role in contributing to the problem of misinformation. All right, so to wrap up, what have we learned? Well, it seems clear that partisan identity is not necessarily the impediment to correction that we might think it is, and that's suggested by literature. And in contrast, a subjective sense of issue importance does seem to interfere with the corrective process. What's tricky is that importance and partisanship are often aligned, and in the previous literature, the two have not been distinguished at all. So this makes it hard to understand the distinctive influence of each factor, and so that's something we're very, very much interested in this project. Going forward, as I said, in our third study, we're attempting to manipulate issue importance to put us on a little bit stronger grounds in talking about the causal impact of this subjective sense of issue importance. And we're also just generally interested in why or how people become misinformed on these important issues, because this is, I think, a novel and pretty surprising result. And so with that, I'm going to close my talk and very much looking forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Jennifer, for this interesting and also hope-giving presentation. It's now time for the Q&A, and so for those of you who are new today, you can type your questions into the Q&A box. That's the two balloons in the middle of your screen, and I will read out the questions, and then Jennifer will address them. I guess people are still writing, so that allows me the opportunity to ask a quick question. What about independents? Were they totally out of this study, or?
They're in our data, but we didn't do anything with them. That's a really interesting point. It wasn't. I think the hypothesis one, the cleanest way to test that is using partisans. I guess we should think about what, sort of think through what's the pattern we would expect with independents. They should, what's interesting is partisans display this unexpected pattern in which they corrected themselves. That would sort of be the pattern I would expect among independents. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't think we're going to get the contrast we expected because partisans took up the information. We actually, at least I haven't done anything with independents. I don't know if you have, Rob, but it would be just interesting as an empirical matter to see what's going on with them. They certainly don't have the partisan motive, right? So that's, I don't know. Do you have any, or you have like gut feelings about what might be observed or what might be going on with them?
Well, they strike me as if you're interested in the distinction between partisanship and issue importance, then they strike me as a very interesting group, because they might find particular issues very important, but they're just not, may or may not update in the same ways as partisans do. So I mean, it could go both ways. I'd say they might be very similar to partisans in terms of updating their beliefs, or they might be very much quicker.
Yeah. So partisanship was pretty unrelated to issue importance on GM foods. We picked it for that reason, but yeah, I guess so. Then, your comment is making me think that maybe the independents might be more susceptible to this bias processing that we've identified via issue importance. Is that your point?
Yep.
Yeah, that's an empirical question. That's interesting, because they are lacking the partisan motive, but they may just have these issue motivations. So yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it. So yeah, independents aren't necessarily in the clear, right?
Okay, I've got two questions now. One from Kiran Basavaraj. I hope that's remotely correctly pronounced. Do you think issue importance would change based on how a misinformation is presented? For example, through satire, memes, etc., and thus in turn affect correction?
Okay, can you repeat that one more time so I can just think about it? Yeah.
So the first question is, do you think issue importance would change based on how misinformation is presented? So the examples given are is it just factual statement or is it satire?
Yeah. That's an interesting question. I think the sense in which it might matter is I'm trying to think. So people come to view issues or topics as important through a couple of different channels. So an issue can be important if it implicates a group, an important group identity. That's how issue importance sometimes gets aligned with partisanship. But people can find issues important because of self-interest or also values. So those are the inputs to issue importance. That's why people come to find issues important. So if the message, or if the way misinformation, I think the way you might see message effects is the way that, in terms of the way this question is being posed, is if some of these channels, whether it be satire or whatever, are better able at getting people to think of an issue in terms of their values, or if that message makes the issue important, given the way it's being delivered, I think that would be how the message matters, is whether it makes a person realize or strengthens that sense of issue importance. So I think that would be how I would think about it. And so I should say also, Rob, please jump in, like wave your hands or just start talking or whatever. But I think the way to theorize this is like to think backwards. What makes issues important? And so then the message, the primary way it should matter is if it's sort of pushing on those mechanisms. That's how I would think about it.
Okay, thanks. Next question from Ursula Daxiker. Thanks so much for the presentation, Jennifer. Two questions. First, could you say a bit more about the corrections in both studies? And secondly, what was the rationale for running two studies rather than using a larger sample?
Okay, let me write this down. Yeah, so the corrections, I can even, maybe I can just sort of go down and show you what they looked like. So in study one, the correction was the same for everybody. It was possible to do that. It didn't exactly look like this. It looked a little more realistic, like the stories themselves. So this was the one for study one. Rob and I we tried to design very authoritative, compelling corrections. We pre-tested them to show to ourselves that they worked. We did this for a couple of reasons. If we're certainly not doing ourselves any favors if we don't have a correction that works, because then you're not going to find a backfire effect. And just for ethical reasons, we thought it was really important to have everybody be corrected in a very effective, authoritative way. Because you need to set people right if you've primed misinformation. So that's what it looks like for study one. We invoke the U.S. Department of Ag and scientists. We have the corrections for the second study. They were all specific to the issue because they had to be, but they had a similar structure. They all had a graph because we were talking about time trends. They all had 3 paragraphs. They were all just completely parallel in terms of how they were organized, or just how the paragraphs were written. So I think the things that we really thought about was just making them effective in an experimental sense, credible. And so I would love to hear what the audience member was thinking, if they were worried about something or just wondering what else were they thinking about on the corrections? And so those were the corrections. We did 2 studies. It was really, Rob and I had been working on this project now it's been a full year. Been designing these studies, and I think we initially thought about doing a within subjects design, and I was a little too worried about carryover effects, and so then we went to a between subjects design. Both of these studies are pretty large, and I think you learn different things from taking a single issue and trying to manipulate the degree to which it's politicized versus having 3 different issues. And so, we had the resources to do this, and so we did it. So it's becoming a very expensive project in that sense. But it was hard for me to choose between a study 1 design and a study 2 design, because I think they each do something different. And so since we were able to do 2, I wanted to. So I'm eager for a follow-up if this person has some additional thoughts on either of these points.
Yeah. Ursula, you can write them in the Q&A box if you have them. Moving on to Tobias Rohrbach. Super interesting studies. Have you found any gender differences in correcting behavior or issue importance perception?
We didn't, there was no real, I'm not aware of any expectation regarding gender, so we have not looked for that. And, we've mainly just pretty much restricted ourselves to think, looking for moderating effects where we had some strong priors. And so the main one that we sort of theorized in advance had to do with some of these need for variables, like need for cognition or need for closure. Those would be places where you might think a person would resist correction. I may not be familiar enough with the gender literature to know which way that would cut. So we've not looked for moderating effects because that sort of wasn't on my radar in terms of thinking that would be a major moderator. On GM foods, women are, I think there is a gender difference in terms of importance on GM foods. There wasn't partisan differences, but I think women were more likely to think it was important. There were a couple of other predictors of importance on GM foods, such as risk attitudes, a couple of others. So that's where gender comes into play. But again, if there's some existing literature on gender differences in correction, I'm certainly eager to hear it.
Okay, next question from Isabella Rabasso. Thanks a lot for your talk. Very interesting studies and results. I have 2 questions about the GM and abortion issues. First, is it possible that Democrats assume that GM is a liberal issue and therefore do not correct more if it is liberal politicized? Could this also explain why Republicans are stronger motivated reasoners on this issue? Shall I read out the second question later? You do this
one? Read it later. I'm just trying to think about this. So, can you read this first one again?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think you can also see it, right, Christian? Yeah. So you can open the Q&A box too.
Okay.
And there
Let me go to the table. That might help too.
Yeah.
Because I'm just trying to think about that pattern. Where's this?
I believe when we pre-tested, we didn't find any differences on partisanship in one of our pre-tests.
In terms of importance on GM foods?
Yes, there is no difference between partisans,
That's, we also don't, in these data themselves. So it's not, I'm just trying to think about the logic of the question that Democrats, they view it as a friendly issue, meaning I guess that means that they like it, and so that's why they correct. But then I'm just trying to think about the point on abortion. This is where it's probably because I wasn't able to show you the stimuli. It's a little, you don't have, nobody has a good feel for the facts, especially regarding abortion. So let me just talk through abortion a minute.
Sure.
On that issue, the information presented, it was definitely not friendly or congenial to Republicans, because the misinformation had to do with rates of abortion in the United States and access. And so it's a fact that abortions are going down in the US, and that a big part of the reason why they're going down is that access to these procedures is going down. And so this is a fact that should be pretty uncomfortable for a lot of Republicans to accept. I think that would strongly go against their priors. And so that's the sense in which it's pretty surprising that their level of misinformation about those two trends went down. So it is definitely a Republican issue and an issue they feel strongly about, but the facts really did challenge their priors. And so that wasn't apparent from the presentation because I didn't have enough time to show the stimuli, but we were trying to identify trends that we had a pretty strong feeling would really like rub against a person's partisan inclinations. So I think there was a second question though that I told you to.
Yeah, the second question is, could you talk a bit more about the abortion correction treatment? Isn't it surprising that correction is so successful on this issue despite it being highly politicized?
Yeah, it's completely surprising. Let me just show it to you. So this was the initial story. So in the second study, the stories are shorter, but they do the job. They sort of prime the misinformation. And then this is the abortion study. It is surprising. And it's, but I guess at the same time there is there's and Rob could probably talk about this since he heard this presentation a couple weeks ago. There's some work by Alex Kopic and others, and so there's these, part of this patchwork of empirical findings in the literature on misinformation is that we are finding instances where respondents, even partisan respondents, take up corrective information. And so Alex Kopic has a study on this topic. Wood and Porter have a recent political behavior article where they show evidence for correction, and so they're failing to find evidence for backfire effects. I don't think the issues in the Wood and Porter story or Wood and Porter article are quite as politicized as abortion. So it is surprising, but it just might mean that partisanship is not the barrier that we thought it was, and that sometimes it can be, but the interference or the psychological motive to resist a correction might be a much more personal phenomenon that relates to the subjective sense of issue importance. And we might be mistaking it for partisanship because on a lot of partisan issues, people also find that issue important. And we've blended these two together. And so that would be my sense. That's how I think about this abortion pattern.
Okay, thanks. We're moving to Matthijs Roduin. Thanks, Jennifer. Very interesting project. Could you tell us a bit more about what you know about the effect of the source of corrections? For instance, corrections made on Fox News will convince other people than those made on CNN. In other words, when evaluating corrections, people probably take into account the source of the correction. Have you considered to also vary the source of correction in this or another study?
Yeah, that's a really good point. We know that we think that matters. I think it probably does. So our studies were pretty large and we had a lot of cells. And so I think the main reason why we didn't pursue sources was just for N purposes. It would just expand the study that much more. After having done, reviewed this literature on misinformation, I think the one lesson I took was that you need a credible source. I guess you can have credibility a couple of different ways. So Adam Berinsky's work has shown that, Republicans might correct on abortion even more if the correction came from a credible source, meaning a fellow Republican. He has some evidence on that point. It's not super strong in that BJPS piece, but I think the rationale for that pattern makes complete sense because people will find a co-partisan credible. And I believe that. I think that definitely matters. We didn't manipulate that here mainly because we just didn't have the space in terms of the size of our sample. But what we did think was important was to have a very credible correction. And so we tried, that was important to us to find something that seemed pretty neutral and something that we thought partisans from opposite sides would look at and not be skeptical of. And then also have a visual to try and reinforce that. So that's what we were thinking. I fully recognize that the source matters. It just, as many of you know, if you're running experiments, at some point you have to stop manipulating things. And it's so the fact that we didn't do it doesn't mean I don't think it's important or we didn't think it's interesting. We just sort of ran out of sample, basically.
Yeah. There's a question from Bert, and then after Bert, there's room for a few more questions. So please type them into the Q&A box.
Yes, thanks, Jen, for this really exciting talk. I have a question for you, which comes back a little bit to this idea of is it issue importance, or so what can you do in the design to show that it's issue importance and not factors that are correlated with issue importance? Such as, like, I'm thinking about, when are people misinformed? Is that because they just lack a general sense of knowledge about politics relating to some, or is that something? Are these factors completely independent? So I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts about that. But what can we do to prove? Like, obviously, your first study, if you start manipulating issue importance, you can get causal control over it. But in the studies you've done now, are there other things that could explain that component?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's the third study will help. I'm just, we don't. I'm just trying to think what that something else is. I feel like a clue to this is with this question that I ended with, which is, why or how do people who find an issue important become misinformed about it? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm working from what we know about why people think issues are important, because there's a large literature on that, I think, or at least there's an established literature about these sources of importance. And there has to be, I guess what we don't know is whether people who find an issue relevant or important or whatever term you want to use, are they generally misinformed about those issues? I don't know that. I think that's a really interesting question.
Your second study could test that, right?
Oh, well, we do, yeah. It is in the second study. That is absolutely the case. We can use our placebo cases for that. Yeah. And I was really surprised that pattern held across all three issues. And I don't know why that would be the case. These are very different issues. And so this is a real puzzle to me. I think it's very provocative if that's a general pattern, because you wouldn't, there's nothing in the theory of, in Krosnick's work or Howie Levine or anybody else who's worked on issue importance, there's no reason to think that those people would necessarily be misinformed about those issues. I guess the other thing that's been cycling around in my mind is maybe the process by which a person comes to think an issue is important, that they're getting bad information. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's just a very wandering set of comments.
No,
But
it's
it's just that I think, I don't know, this is the part of the project that I think is the most interesting. But I don't have all the answers to it.
Could I ask you one quick follow-up question, which is related to terms of sort of experimental practice? Like some people have said on some of the work I've done, where they said, well, if you have these factors like cognitive reflection or need for cognition, and especially sort of partisanship, when you ask these pre-treatment, are you not priming people? And so the solution is to do a much more expensive design and in wave one measure these variables, and then a week later come back. What are your thoughts on are you sharing these concerns that in a similar survey asking the sort of like issue importance first and then do experiment, is that an issue, or say, well, don't worry about this?
Yeah, no, I think there's competing considerations, right? So there's this the concern that those people were raising versus cost, and I guess it's where which concern is more important to you. With issue importance, we did have in our survey flow, we had some filler stuff. We had in the first study, we had another placebo story they read. So we put some stuff in between it to try to alleviate that problem. I'm trying to remember, Rob, partisanship is pre-treatment, right? In both of our studies?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, so this is the thing. If you don't measure it pre-treatment, then someone's going to jump on you for post-treatment bias.
You're right.
So you have to pick what's important to you and defend it, and then just find a way to inoculate yourself against those criticisms. I mean, it's hard to imagine something that's more expensive than a multi-wave study just so that you can have a pre-treatment measure of partisanship. So that's, maybe somebody who's got a gigantic research account can make those critiques, but that's for the ordinary person, that's not very realistic. It's still you want to think about whether that's a concern, and I think you can do a lot with, we've tried to put in some little distractor questions or just ask people questions that gets their mind going in a different place. Right. I think that can be effective.
Bert, can you take over for me? I have to sign a package at the door.
That's important. That's also important.
We have a new seminar participant.
There's another question from Isabella. Wait, there's 3 questions here. Okay, so first, Isabella's the question is, have you also measured how confident people are in their knowledge about issues, which you mentioned in the paper and is related to personal importance of an issue? If so, does this affect correction of misinformation?
Our measures, and Rob, I'll let you speak on this too, sort of in the measures are, people are asked to gauge the truth or falsity of statements. So GM foods are less nutritious than conventional foods. And so we have, this is one of Rob's dissertation projects, is that it's a format that measures a person's belief, but then also folds in their degree of confidence so that we are assessing that in a single item and not taking up a lot of space and then separately asking about confidence. So that's Rob's innovation. And also because just conceptually, theoretically, the sense of confidence or certainty is a part of like misinformation. And so we think that's an important element to it. So it is in there. I didn't make that very obvious. I didn't know if you want to jump in, Rob, with anything else on this point.
Yeah, I can. It's basically a 6-point definitely true to definitely false scale, right? So the extremes indicate more confidence, and as you go to the middle point, indicates more uncertainty. So I've been calling these measures the all-in-one measure because you're measuring accuracy in the terms of true or false, but we're also measuring the confidence in terms of like how true or false you believe that item it is. So yeah, I guess we measure the confidence and knowledge. That's a really important point. I totally agree with Isabella.
Thank you. I think, well, it's 2 minutes to 4, so let's round up a little bit. Jan and Rob, I want to thank you for this excellent presentation, really interesting project, and we're obviously very curious to hear what the third pre-registered study will show here. I want to take the last minute to announce a couple of the speakers that will come. So next week, Ashley Jardina from Duke University will talk about white identity politics. The week after, we have Ursula Hess, who will talk about nonverbal behavior mimicry. The week after, we have two PhD students externally, Tobias Rohrbach and Lala Muradova. And the week after that, then we are December 4th, we have Marieke van der Velde, who's one of our own lab members. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I also want to raise awareness that if you want to do more political psychology, next week, Thursday, so this Thursday from 3 to 5, there is also something that I always have organized offline, which is called the Dutch Political Psychology Meetings, a bit inspired by the New York area political psychology meetings. But this time it's online, and we have actually two speakers also from the United States. We have Patrick Kraft, a former Stony Brook student, and now at the University of Wisconsin, and Amanda Friesen from Indiana to give a presentation. So if you want to join for that meeting, check our website. It's advertised there, or shoot Mike Holman an email. Want to thank you all for this exciting and interesting day today, and I hope to see you all soon again.